I want to begin my speech today by taking us back to the year 1922. Conference a little bit like this one, although in Washington, D.C., the nation's first national radio conference. The purpose of it, which was to decide for once and for all the future of advertising. This was, as I said, the first radio conference that was ever held in the United States. And the radio industry at the time was an industry not unlike today's internet. It was an industry in a state of great conflict and an industry of great uncertainty. At the time, the primary business model, the model that most of the major companies relied on for radio, was to operate radio stations for free. That is to say, have no advertisement, not attempt to charge anyone any prices. And the idea was that good radio stations would lead people to buy radios. So this was a kind of a predecessor to, as we'll see, a sales model, very similar to the ones Apple practices today, and we'll talk about later. But the basic idea is you have the radio station, you broadcast content so that people will buy stuff, a sales-based model. At the time, there was beginning to be a challenger to this model, and this was pioneered by a company known as AT&T, still very much in our lives. And the rival model was to use radio stations to rent time to whoever wanted to use it. So they just operated the radio station if you felt you had something to say. Maybe you didn't feel you liked the president, or you felt you wanted to talk about whatever you want to talk about. You just rented time on the radio and you could speak to everyone. This was sort of the rival model, the carriage model. The problem was, and the reason this radio conference was urgently held, was because the rental model began to look suspiciously like something called advertising. There was a grave danger. And so this conference was held, and the man who would decide the future of advertising for once and for all was none other than Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, later, of course, President of the United States. Here is what he said. He announced the following rule. He said, direct advertising in radio broadcasting service shall be absolutely prohibited. Indirect advertising shall be limited to a statement of the call letters of the station and the name of the concern responsible for the matter broadcasted. So Hoover announced that the solution to the future of advertising, in fact, was to ban it. And he said, in his defense of this rule, he said, it is inconceivable that we should allow so great a possibility for service, for news, for entertainment, for education, for vital commercial purposes to be drowned in advertising chatter. If a speech by the president, he said, is to be used as the meat between the sandwich of two advertisements, there will be no radio left. So this was the earliest sort of idea of what the future of advertising should be in the radio industry, and suffice to say, it did not last. It explains, if you study the history of radio advertising, why many of the early advertisings were what you might say indirect as opposed to direct. I did some research and I uncovered the very first advertisement for Gillette, the manufacturer of razors. What they did is they broadcast a very interesting lecture on the history of beards, where beards went in one direction towards the mustache, towards longer beards, shorter beards, and finally culminated in the sort of perfection of the clean-shaven man, obviously equipped with his safety razor. Suffice to say that this early ban on advertising did not last in radio, and ultimately, radio became dominated, as in broadcasting and ultimately television, became dominated by a market, by a business model premised on advertising revenue. And the reason I tell this story about the early history and the early contest between what I just described as a sales-based model of an industry and the advertising-based model of the industry is because it sets up a conflict which has recurred throughout media throughout all times between different ideas of how to gain revenue, most primarily between a sales model and something of an advertising model. And is also a conflict that I will suggest will dominate the future of the internet. That is to say, that same conflict and in radio and in radio in the 1920s over whether the industry would ultimately be one that depended on advertising revenue or on direct sort of sales revenue, shaped the nature of radio very profoundly. And in our times, that same kind of conflict, very fundamental, will shape the future of the internet. Let me back up a little bit and give you some context for my remarks. I've spent the last several years, I published a book recently, The Master Switch, and spent many years researching the history of communications industries and media industries. And what you see when you look carefully at this history is a pattern that repeats itself. You see disruptive new inventions like the radio, the internet itself, the telephone, the film industry, many other the cable television and other inventions which come along in their time, create in their wake a new entrepreneurial and very open industry. And the features of this industry, as maybe the name of the early open industry, is that it is one in which people with all kinds of ideas for what the business should be are free to sort of experiment and try their hand. I think of the telephone industry of the 1910s, for example. Many people thought in the 1910s that the telephone would be just as useful for broadcasting as for person-to-person communications. So that is to say, there were services that set up, and your phone would ring at 6 p.m., maybe 10 times in a row. You pick it up, and there would be the news, weather reports, and, as the histories say, a little bit of gossip. Radio, of course, began its life as a person-to-person communications technology and ultimately became a broadcasting technology, and ultimately, further from that, became television, only to come back to a person-to-person technology. So there are these periods, these open periods, where really the industry is up for grabs. After some period, 10 or 15 years or so, you see a switch from this open industry into something that is much more consolidated and controlled, often under the rule of a single monopolist or a group of companies. In the telephone industry, in the 1910s, as I said, it was a highly competitive industry, hundreds of, not thousands of telephone companies. It ultimately came under the control of a single company, the great AT&T, the most powerful and perhaps most important communications technologist of the 20th century. The film industry, which was an open, very vibrant industry in the 1920s with hundreds of producers located in San Francisco, New York, New Jersey, Chicago, all around the country. Big industry in Paris, too. Ultimately came under the rule of a smaller group of 4 or 5 companies, the studios, in Hollywood. Television and radio, which I just described in the 20s, very open industries, lots of competitors, all kinds of ideas for what radio could be, ultimately became concentrated under 2 networks, CBS and NBC. And so there is a repeated pattern in these industries. And one of the great questions of our time is whether our new, darling, exciting, unknown medium, the internet, is itself beginning to consolidate, is itself becoming an industry dominated by fewer and fewer players, and is itself increasingly under the control of 1 or more platforms, 1 or 2 more major platforms, who, in a sense which would seem unimaginable in 15 years ago, have the power, in some sense, to really define what the medium is. And in that context, in understanding that moment when these open technologies begin to flip into a more closed form, I think it's really important to understand the question of which revenue model, which business model ends up reigning supreme, because that question has ripple effects for everyone who's connected to these media. Obviously, when you think about it, the fact that advertising as a revenue model became the king, so to speak, of the broadcast industries as opposed to a sales model, ultimately had an enormous effect on your industry, the advertising industry, because it created television as the single greatest tool for advertising ever created the market for which advertising would see its future. And so today, when we see the internet evolving and perhaps consolidating to two platforms, it is, I think, of critical importance to understand the battle between the different revenue models and understand, that's a very difficult question, what might be the conditions that make a sales-based or an advertising-based model more likely to be successful. Well, let me back up just a little bit and talk about the business of selling information or information products and describe 4 very basic revenue models that you might imagine could succeed. The first 2 are sales-type revenue models. Number 1, I described already with radio, you sell some kind of device or some kind of product. I have in mind here, for example, the earlier radio stations, or radio industry, whose basic idea was we are going to sell people radios and everything else is just to get them to sell radios. I have in mind also Apple Computers or Apple Inc., which for years has basically operated most of its exciting operations like its various app stores, iTunes Download, and so forth, for the primary purpose of selling people the underlying hardware. This is a model that's had its success over the years. The second model, also quite popular, is to sell some kind of service or basically what we think of as content sales. This is a traditional model of the film industry, for example, which has never really fully relied on advertising. And instead, it charges you a price to get into a special room and see the product. Telephone industry, interestingly, another purveyor of information, gives you the power to connect with other people. That is the content, and they are selling you this service. Again, somewhat adverse to any form of advertising model. The third model is one based on advertising, and I've already described radio broadcasting and later television broadcasting as the predominant leading example in the history of the 20th century of a technological platform or technological medium that survives based on that model. And so that's the third. In our times, the web, with a few exceptions, has mostly met its successful companies, such as Google, or some of the online content sites, Slate and so forth, other online content, deriving its revenue mostly from advertising. And the fourth model, which I don't think should be overlooked, are revenue models based to some degree on donations or taxes. The original in this genre was the British BBC, which relied on a tax on radio receivers. Today, our National Public Radio, or PBS, is the same model. And in the high-tech industries, a company like Wikipedia is really ultimately relying on donations to do its business, or Mozilla, the famous manufacturer of open-source browsers. So all 4 of these different revenue models, and I'll sum them again, selling a product, selling a service, relying on advertising, or relying on donations. All 4 of these, in their time, have powered successful industries. And the real question for the future is which of these will predominate or which will sink and become less important. Well, let's turn the internet of our times to try and get something of a handle on these questions. I want to suggest to you that the internet is undergoing profound change. It's always undergoing profound change, but this time I really mean it. Because what's changing is the nature of change itself. We've used to the idea that the internet is the thing that is always changing. We're used to the idea that every 6 months or so, maybe even a month or so, a new company is being born, maybe we don't know what it is right now, in some garage, that comes and overturns everything that was there before. We've seen this so many times in our lifetime. We've seen AOL, the great champion, defeated. It's made a little bit of a comeback lately, but generally speaking, not the mighty titan it once was. Even Microsoft, mighty Microsoft, once feared around the world, making people tremble in their boots, has seen become something more of a pussycat, albeit a very large pussycat, but still a less sort of dangerous or dominating company. We've seen Google seemingly rise out of nowhere to take the world by storm, followed later by Facebook. And so the sort of mythology, not even the mythology, the history of the internet, its creed is the place that never changes, never quite comfortable, always in transition. Well, what I'm suggesting is that that was true of all the other new industries as well. That is to say, if we were sitting here, and this was the radio conference in 1925, we'd be saying, radio is always changing. Every year there's a new company, a new approach, and it turns out to be completely different. Nothing is like we ever thought it was before. The telephone industry, the same. Film industry was in a state of constant change for almost 20 years. But eventually, all things change, even change itself, and the industry begins to mature. And I believe what we are seeing in our time is a slowdown and a consolidation of the internet into a structure where instead of a sort of constant cycle of life and death, we have the emergence of a big four or a big five. That is to say, 4 or 5 major platforms, which are not the only companies who do business on the internet, but have a predominant influence. And what's interesting for purposes of this conversation is that these major platforms rely on different revenue models, which ultimately will determine the fate of the advertising industry. So the 4 companies that I think are the greatest contenders, and it could still be more years before things settle down more, are Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and possibly Microsoft as a sort of a 5th, depending on some of their designs. And linked to them some of the underlying companies, AT&T and Verizon, and in the United States and other companies in other countries. So you can see a future where these are sort of the companies that are the mega platforms, the super platforms. They own major operating systems, or they own some crucial gateway, as in the case of Google, or they have some established economies of scale, delivery system like Amazon, where their position becomes increasingly more secure and they become more and more difficult to push out of their seat. Now, I don't know if that means they'll last as long as AT&T did. 70 years was AT&T. NBC ruled broadcasting for decades, NBC, CBS, and ultimately ABC. I'm not, at this point, sure that's going to be the same kind of tenure, but I do believe we're entering a phase of a sort of slowdown and a move towards consolidation. Well, what does this mean for the advertising industry? The interesting thing is that of the 2 greatest platforms of our time, Apple and Google, each of those is premised primarily and fundamentally on a very different business model. Apple, as you probably well know, is doesn't always agree with this description, but is generally speaking a much more closed platform. And the one point I want to make generally is that if you understand the distinction between closed and open platforms, the interesting thing is that the closed platforms historically have tended to rely on sales models as opposed to advertising models. That is to say, what I mean by closed, that the business models that allow you, through physical property or something else, to prevent consumers from getting access to the product tend to rely on a model where they sell things to the consumer as opposed to try and advertise on top of it. Now, the contrast is a company like Google, or in fact the entire World Wide Web, which is dependent so far and has had much less success in making money off anything but an advertising model. And the corresponding observation is that open platforms or open systems have tended historically and including today to depend on advertising. When you think about radio carefully and you think, well, why did radio and broadcasting ultimately turn to advertising? One of the main reasons, when you think about it, is they weren't able to prevent a consumer with a radio from getting access to their content. So if that's true, if you think of a consumer with a radio, being able to tune in to whatever radio waves are out there with ease, you're not going to be, it's very difficult to charge him for the individual programs, and therefore advertising comes into prominence as a major model. So what that suggests, and what I want to leave you with and urge you to watch carefully, is to watch very carefully the conflict between Apple and Google. And at a more profound level, to watch very carefully what is referred to in the media and other places as these contests between open and closed systems. Because while they may sound sometimes to be merely ideological kind of conflicts, at a deeper level, they are conflicts about what is going to be the ruling business model. And my general sense is that closed models will always lead more to sales-based business models, which will please many members of industries who are trying to actually sell products or content, and that open and easily accessed forms of media will tend to support or predominantly be based on advertising models. So to sum this all up, I think I've put a lot in here, and I hope it makes some sense. But I'm trying to suggest that many of the challenges we are facing today, or many of the questions that are posed as the internet evolves, have been faced before in one place or another in different media. And that we can learn an awful lot, and the master switches never do this, from looking at the same kind of conflicts that occurred in previous industries before the internet. And if there's one thing we can learn, it is there are these deeper patterns, this conflict between a more open media and a more closed media, conflict between product-based sales and advertising-based models that shall recur over and over again. And if history is any guide, we should expect to see a return to an age, if not of pure monopoly, of greater dominance. Thank you very much. Sure, I'd love to talk about that. The question is about the New York Times moving towards a model of a subscription. I had said that there were 4 major revenue models, and that the fourth, and not to be overlooked one, is donations. I would suggest, I'm sure the New York Times wouldn't necessarily like this description, that the New York Times is moving towards a membership model, not unlike NPR or PBS. In other words, what they're trying to do is find the people who really like the New York Times a lot, and in some ways appeal to them, and not a very charitable description, but as a charity in some ways, and say, listen, help us out, subscribe, you know you like us, and we do all this important stuff. And so, yeah, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, that there's a general move of newspapers towards more models that are more similar to donation-based or tax-supported models. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Actually, this is something I'd forgot to mention. So part of what affects the future, the growth and development of these media over time is, of course, the role of government. And government has stepped in throughout American history to make decisions. We saw Herbert Hoover at the beginning trying to suggest that radio should be free of advertisements forever. The government essentially guaranteed AT&T its monopoly for a very long time, and government later on would destroy and break up AT&T. And so the government always has a role. Right now, the government has seen its position through the net neutrality discussion of trying to keep the internet open. And the implication of that, and what's interesting about that, is that an open internet position is one that tends to support advertising-based revenue models. So whether that was on purpose or not, I'm sure it's not. The net neutrality rules, in some ways, are beneficial to increased advertising models, while, yeah, so I'll just leave it there. I mean, I think there is, in terms of what I think the right policy should be, I think that government does have a role in trying to suggest that these media remain open and a place for people to speak freely. I think it's, if you look at events in the Middle East and so forth, I think it's rather important. And that's a very general statement, but that's what I believe. But I think the really interesting insight is that there is some connection between net neutrality rules, very controversial, and advertising-based revenue models.
The government seems to be seriously threatening to shut down National Public Radio. And in the context of the models that you've been talking about and the implications of that, I wondered if you would comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm afraid working. I have plenty to say about it, but I don't think I should. It's sort of a. I don't think I should comment on it because I currently work for the federal government. I don't think I should. Plenty to say personally about it, but I don't think I should comment on the. Congress is a co-equal branch of government that comes up with its own ideas now and then. I'll just leave it there. I'll also say that there is, in most countries outside the United States, there has been a far greater role for the fourth revenue model I described, that is donation or tax-based things. And that has definitely, the United States is definitely much smaller compared to other countries' support for public media. So it's already quite small, just to leave it there. But I don't want to comment on our actions of our friends in the congressional branch. Yes. Looks like we're out of time. Thank you very much.